The rain fell on Harrison County, Ohio, not with anger, but with a deep and saturating purpose. It was a silent, soaking rain, the kind that buries the world under a heavy, gray sheet, muffling all sound and blurring the sharp edges of the landscape. The town, usually humming with the quiet energy of agriculture and small-town life, had slowed to a reverent hush. Plumes of steam rose from diner vents, windows glowed with a warm, orange light, and the rolling, wooded hills that surrounded them became soft, ethereal giants against the bruised sky. This was the heart of a summer storm, profoundly beautiful and deeply isolating. For Jake Callahan, the quiet was both a gift and a challenge. A chief petty officer in the United States Navy SEALs, he was a man forged in noise and chaos, in the deafening roar of helicopter rotors and the concussive clap of conflict. Home on a rare 2-week leave, he found the stillness of his hometown unsettling. He was in his mid-30s with a lean, powerful frame that spoke of relentless conditioning. His hair was cut short and neat, and his face, usually clean-shaven by military regulation, now sported the dark stubble of a minor civilian rebellion. But it was the eyes that truly defined him. They were a cool, assessing gray, constantly scanning, evaluating, and processing his surroundings with an intensity that never fully switched off. Beside him, moving with a fluid and powerful grace, was Ghost. A magnificent German shepherd, Ghost was more than a dog. He was a partner. His coat was a rich blend of black and tan. His muscles rippled beneath his thick fur, and his intelligent amber eyes missed nothing. Every movement was precise, economical, a testament to the same elite training that had shaped Jake. They were a unit, their bond forged not in a suburban backyard, but in harsh simulations, in the biting cold of Arctic training exercises and the suffocating heat of desert deployments. They communicated in a language beyond words, a shared understanding built on absolute trust. Their daily run was a ritual, a necessity for them both. It was a way to burn off the ceaseless energy that built up in man and animal accustomed to constant action. They moved along a familiar, muddy trail through the woods, their synchronized breaths puffing out in faint clouds in the humid air. The only sounds were the rhythmic squelch of Jake's boots on the packed earth and the soft padding of Ghost's paws. The oak trees, heavy with their wet, green burden, stood like silent sentinels, their branches bowed low. The world was a monochrome painting of black, green, and gray. They were 3 miles in, the damp air a pleasant burn in Jake's lungs, when the rhythm broke. Ghost stopped dead. His body went rigid, a sculpture of coiled muscle and sudden focus. His head was up, nostrils flaring as he tasted the wind. A low, almost inaudible whine vibrated deep in his chest. His ears, which had been relaxed, were now swiveled forward like small radar dishes, locked onto something far beyond Jake's perception. Jake halted, his own senses instantly on high alert. He followed Ghost's gaze, but saw nothing but the endless dance of the falling rain and the deep shadows between the trees. He listened. The wind was a liar in these hills. It could mimic voices, carry strange whispers through the hollows. He heard nothing but its mournful sigh through the leaves. "What is it, buddy?" Jake murmured, his voice low. Ghost didn't look at him. He took one hesitant step forward, then another, his gaze fixed on a point far off the trail to their left. He whined again, this time with a clear note of urgency. He looked back at Jake, his amber eyes pleading, then turned and began to push his way through the deep, untouched undergrowth, away from the safety of the path. Jake hesitated. His training screamed at him to assess the situation. It was likely an animal, a deer or a coyote, maybe injured. Nothing that required the attention of a Navy SEAL. The logical thing was to stay on the path, finish the run, return to the warmth of the small farmhouse he'd rented. But his training screamed something else, too, a lesson drilled into him over years of hard-won experience. Trust your partner, always. Ghost wasn't just a dog. He was a highly trained asset. His senses were calibrated to detect things that were out of place, things that were wrong. He wouldn't react this way to a common woodland creature. This was different. Jake could see it in the taut line of the dog's spine, in the way his tail was low and stiff. This was a signal. "All right," Jake said, letting out a slow breath. "Okay, lead the way." The words were all Ghost needed. He surged forward, his powerful legs churning through the mud and wet leaves. The going immediately became tougher. Jake followed, the thick brush soaking the legs of his pants, the dampness seeping in. His focus shifted. He was no longer a man on a recreational run. His combat instinct surfaced. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for tracks, signs of disturbance, anything out of the ordinary. His mind began to build a tactical map of the terrain, noting angles, cover, and potential ambush points. They moved like this for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. Ghost never faltered, his determination pulling Jake deeper into the woods, up a gentle slope. The scent, whatever it was, must have been getting stronger. Ghost's movements became more frantic, more urgent. Then, through the curtain of rain, a shape began to resolve itself, a dark, angular silhouette against the gray. It was a building, or what was left of one, large, sprawling, and ruined. A faded wooden sign, half swallowed by overgrown ivy, still bore the peeling, cheerful letters of a bygone era, Blackwood Farm. Jake knew the place. It had been abandoned for more than a decade, a victim of a bad economy and changing times. Now it was a ghost, a place for teenagers to dare each other on summer nights. In a storm like this, it was utterly forgotten, swallowed by the rain and the silence. Ghost didn't slow. He led Jake around the side of the decaying structure, past boarded-up windows and a collapsed porch, to the rear of the building. Here the mud and leaves had piled high against the foundation. Ghost stopped at a specific spot and began to dig, his paws sending sprays of dark earth flying. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, whining continuously. Jake moved to his side, his heart beginning to beat a heavy, steady rhythm in his chest. What Ghost was uncovering was a small, rectangular shape. A cellar window, its glass long gone, now covered by a warped piece of plywood and buried under at least a foot of soil and debris. The wind howled, whipping rain around them, but Jake barely felt the chill. All his attention was on his partner. Ghost paused his digging for a moment and pressed his nose into the small gap he'd cleared, sniffing intently. Then came the sound that sent a spike of ice through Jake's veins. From deep in Ghost's throat came a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but of confirmation. It was the sound he was trained to make when he had identified a target. It was the sound that meant one thing: someone was in there, and they were in trouble. The growl was a physical thing, a vibration that traveled from Ghost's chest through the sodden ground and into the bones of Jake's hands. It was the sound of certainty. Jake didn't waste a second. He worked with the practiced efficiency of a man whose life often depended on the speed of his actions. Using his gloved hands, he clawed the remaining mud and leaves away from the plywood covering the cellar window, creating a small gap at the top just wide enough to see through. He pressed his face close, the damp chill of the wood seeping through his hood. The air that escaped from the cellar was stale and cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of fear and decay. Inside, a single, bare bulb hung from a frayed wire, casting a weak, sickly yellow light that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive concrete walls. The space was mostly empty, save for a few rotted wooden shelves and scattered debris. And in the center of it all, there was a chair. And in the chair, there was a person. At first, it was just a silhouette. A human form slumped forward, head bowed, hands bound behind their back. But then the figure stirred, a weak, pained movement, and their head lifted slightly, turning just enough to catch the dim light. Jake's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, broken gasp. It was a woman. Her face was bruised and pale, her dark hair was matted and tangled, but even in the weak light, he recognized her instantly. It was the face that had looked out from posters in the windows of every shop in Harrison County. The face that had been the subject of solemn news reports on the local radio station he'd been listening to all week. Deputy Sarah Jenkins. The announcer's voice echoed in his memory, a calm, professional tone delivering the grim facts. 32 years old, a decorated officer with the Harrison County Sheriff's Department, last seen responding to a call that was later determined to be a fake. Her patrol car found abandoned. No sign of a struggle, vanished without a trace. The reports had painted a picture of a woman who was more than a uniform. They spoke of her organizing the town's youth league, of her reputation for de-escalating tense situations with a quiet word instead of a show of force, of her being the first to volunteer for the most thankless community tasks. She was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community, a protector, and now she was a prisoner, bound and helpless in the forgotten cellar of a dead building. His SEAL training kicked in, shoving aside the initial shock and replacing it with a cold, clear analysis. He scanned the scene with a tactical eye. Her posture was weak, but she was conscious. That was good. The ropes binding her were thick, and from what he could see of the knots holding her wrists, they were not the clumsy work of an amateur. They were complex, efficient, and tight. He recognized the pattern of a bowline knot. They were knots designed to tighten with movement. Professional. That was bad. Very bad. It suggested a captor with a specific skill set, someone who knew what they were doing. The cellar had only one visible exit, a heavy wooden door at the top of a short flight of concrete stairs. The door was closed. He had no way of knowing if it was locked or guarded. The building itself was a structural nightmare. A direct assault, even for him, was suicide. The rotted floors could give way. The noise would alert the captor, and Sarah would be dead before he could get to her. Calling 911 from here was just as dangerous. The sirens would be a death sentence. He needed a plan. He needed intel. He pulled back from the window, his mind racing through scenarios, probabilities, and risks. Ghost was still beside him, motionless, but his body was a taut line of readiness. The dog's gaze was no longer on the window, but on a spot several feet to the right, where the ground was disturbed. Ghost lowered his head and nudged something with his nose. Jake moved over, crouching low. Ghost had found the edge of something dark protruding from the mud. Carefully, Jake brushed the wet soil away. It was a glove, a black tactical police glove made of thick, reinforced leather. It must have been dropped in the struggle, lost in the chaos and the rain. He picked it up. It was stiff with cold mud, but as he turned it over in his hand, he saw something that made him pause. On the cuff, stitched in neat, precise lines, was a small, personal emblem. It wasn't standard issue. It was a small, stylized image of an oak leaf embroidered in dark green thread. It was a unique identifier, the kind of thing someone adds to make their uniform their own. A little piece of personality in a world of conformity. It was a piece of her. It was proof. More than that, it was a direct link, a tangible thing that proved she had been here. He stood up. The glove was clutched in his hand. The mission parameters had just become crystal clear in his mind. Phase 1, reconnaissance, was complete. He had the hostage's location and a piece of forensic evidence. Phase 2, extraction, would require a team, the right equipment, and a flawless plan. And he knew with a gut-deep certainty that he couldn't create that plan alone. He looked down at Ghost, whose amber eyes were locked on him, awaiting orders. Jake gave a low, sharp whistle, barely a sound in the wind, and made a silent hand signal. Withdraw. Silent withdrawal. Ghost understood instantly. He turned without a sound and began to retrace their path, his movements once again stealthy and precise. Jake took one last look at the ruined farmhouse, a dark tomb in the gray storm. He slipped the cold glove into a secure pocket of his jacket. They were leaving, but they would be back. He would make sure of it. He and Ghost melted back into the trees. Two shadows moving through the rainstorm, carrying a terrible secret and the fragile hope of a town. The withdrawal was a ghost's passage. Jake and Ghost moved through the dense woods with a shared, disciplined silence. Their tracks were quickly washed away by the relentless rain. The adrenaline that had sharpened Jake's senses now cooled into a hard weight in his gut. He had a location. He had proof. But information was useless without a viable course of action. And every scenario he ran through his head ended in a flare of unacceptable risk. He couldn't just storm the building. That was the move of a movie hero. And in the real world, it got hostages killed. An anonymous tip was just as dangerous. The inevitable swarm of sirens and squad cars would turn the farmhouse into a fortress and sign Sarah Jenkins's death warrant. The captor, whoever he was professional enough to use bowl and knots. He would be professional enough to have an exit strategy, and it wouldn't include leaving a witness. Jake needed a surgical approach, an inside track. He needed a way to deliver his intelligence without setting off a bomb. He skirted the main road, sticking to the dripping quiet of the back trails that led to the edge of town. His destination wasn't the brightly lit, official facade of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department. Not yet. He needed someone he could trust implicitly, someone who understood the pulse of the town, not just its laws. 20 minutes later, he emerged from the tree line behind a small, welcoming-looking building. A warm yellow light spilled from its windows, a beacon in the gray gloom. The smell of frying bacon and coffee cut through the sterile cold. The sign above the door, hand-painted on a weathered piece of oak, read, "The Round Table Diner." He left Ghost under the small awning, the dog settling into a silent, watchful downstay on command. Jake pushed the door open, a small bell heralding his arrival. The warmth inside was a welcome shock. The diner was the heart of the town, small and intimate with mismatched wooden chairs and local art on the walls. Behind the counter, wiping down the gleaming chrome coffee machine, was Maggie. Maggie was a Harrison County fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the rolling hills. She was in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun and a dusting of freckles across her nose that the summer sun had brought out. Her eyes were a clear, warm green, and they lit up with genuine pleasure when she saw him. She and Jake had grown up together, their friendship an easy, comfortable thing that had endured his long absences. "Jake Callahan, I'll be," she said, her smile reaching her eyes. "Don't you know there's a storm out there? I was just about to close up." "I know, Maggie. I'm sorry. I need your help," Jake said, his voice low and serious. He moved to the counter, the urgency in his tone cutting through the diner's peaceful atmosphere. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. She knew his work voice. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse." He pulled the cold, muddy tactical glove from his jacket pocket and placed it on the polished wood of the counter. It lay there between them, a dark, ominous shape. "Do you recognize this?" Maggie leaned in, her brow furrowed. She picked it up, her fingers flinching slightly at the damp chill. She turned it over, and her breath caught as she saw the small, embroidered oak leaf on the cuff. Her eyes shot up to his, wide with shock and horror. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is Sarah's. She showed it to me last month. Her grandfather was a forester. She had it put on all her gear." Her gaze locked on his. "Where did you find this?" "About 4 miles north of here, at the old Blackwood farm," he said, his voice flat. "She's there, Maggie. She's alive. I saw her. She's tied up in the cellar." The color drained from Maggie's face. For a moment, she just stared, processing the impossible. Then her resolve hardened. She was not the panicking type. She set the glove back on the counter and looked him dead in the eye. "We have to call Sheriff Miller right now." "No," Jake countered instantly. "No sirens, no big response. Not yet. Whoever has her isn't an amateur. A full-scale approach will get her killed. I need to talk to them, but it has to be quiet. I need them to listen to me." Maggie nodded slowly, understanding his reasoning. "Miller can be stubborn. He goes by the book, but you have to tell him." She reached for her coat. "I'm coming with you. He'll listen to me." The Harrison County Sheriff's Department was a small, functional brick building that looked more like a town hall than a bastion of law enforcement. The storm had kept most people home and the station was quiet. A young deputy at the front desk looked up in surprise as they entered. "Maggie, Jake, what are you two doing out in this?" "We need to see Sheriff Miller, Mark." "It's an emergency," Maggie said, her tone firm. Sheriff Brody Miller was a man carved from the same granite as the hills around them. He was in his late 50s with a solid build, a face weathered by decades of Ohio seasons, and a thick, silver mustache. His eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. He looked up from a pile of paperwork as they were ushered into his office, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance at the interruption. "This had better be good," he grumbled, leaning back in his creaking leather chair. Jake placed the glove on the sheriff's cluttered desk. "Deputy Jenkins," Jake said, getting straight to the point. "I know where she is." The sheriff's demeanor changed instantly. He sat bolt upright, his focus entirely on Jake. Maggie quickly relayed the story, explaining how Jake and his dog had found the farmhouse, the window, and the glove. Jake interjected with the critical details. "She's in the cellar tied to a chair. The knots are professional Bolins. The building is structurally unsound. A loud entry is not an option. You need a quiet, tactical approach." Sheriff Miller listened, his gaze shifting from Jake to the glove and back again. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Skepticism. "Son, you're a SEAL. I get that. You see tactics everywhere, but you've been trespassing on private property, and now you're telling me how to run my investigation based on a peek through a muddy window." "With all due respect, Sheriff," Jake said, keeping his voice even. "I'm telling you that your deputy is in imminent danger from a captor who knows what he's doing. Your standard operating procedure will create a barricade situation, and she will be the first casualty." The tension in the small office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Before the sheriff could reply, a third voice joined the conversation, calm and precise. "The knots, you said they were Bolins." Jake turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman in a sergeant's uniform. She was younger than the sheriff, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun and intelligent dark eyes that were analyzing him with unnerving intensity. Her name tag read, Rios. "That's right," Jake replied, recognizing a fellow professional. Sergeant Olivia Rios stepped fully into the room. She was lean and moved with a quiet confidence. "Be specific. Most kidnappers use whatever they can find. Duct tape, simple overhands. A Bolin is a specific choice. It's meant for restraint without failure." She looked from Jake to the sheriff. "He's right, Sheriff. That detail matters. It suggests a level of sophistication we haven't been accounting for." Sheriff Miller grunted, clearly torn between his procedural instincts and the sharp, undeniable logic being presented by his sergeant and the intense SEAL standing before him. He stared at Jake, a long, calculating look. "You bring me an unbelievable story and expect me to throw my rulebook out the window. I expect you to do what's necessary to bring your deputy home safe," Jake said, his gray eyes unwavering. "And I'm telling you, the book isn't going to work this time." The silence in Sheriff Miller's office stretched, thin and fragile. It was the silence of a stalemate. Brody Miller, a man accustomed to being the unquestioned authority in any room, was now caught between the rigid certainty of his rulebook and the unshakable confidence of two professionals telling him it was obsolete. He stared at the tactical glove on his desk as if it were a pulled pin grenade. Finally, he let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man choosing the lesser of two evils. He fixed his gaze on Sergeant Rios. "Rios, get Mr. Callahan and his dog to the briefing room. Get everything he has, every detail, every angle. I want a full tactical breakdown of that location." Then he turned to Jake, his eyes narrowed. "But you listen to me, son. This is my town and my deputy. We do this my way, quietly. No grandstanding, no freelance operations. You are a civilian consultant. Nothing more. Are we clear?" "Crystal, Sheriff," Jake said, his expression unreadable. The briefing room was a stark contrast to the sheriff's cluttered office. It was a clean, sterile space dominated by a large conference table, whiteboards covered in scrawled notes, and a wall of topographical maps of the county. Maggie, sensing her part in this was over, had given Jake a worried but encouraging look. "Be careful," she'd whispered before heading back out into the storm. As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere shifted. This was a room for work. Ghost, who had been waiting patiently in the hall, followed them in and immediately began to pace the length of the far wall. His claws made soft clicking sounds on the linoleum floor. It wasn't an anxious pace, but a relentless, purposeful one. A low whine escaped his throat, a constant, quiet hum that filled the room with a palpable tension. He was a living reminder that their clock was ticking. Sergeant Olivia Rios was already in motion, her movements economical and precise. She was the kind of person who seemed to draw energy from a crisis, her focus sharpened to a razor's edge. "Start with the farmhouse," she said, her voice all business. She pulled up a satellite image of the area on a large monitor. "Show me." While Rios got set up, Jake began his own process. He was not a man who waited. "You have blueprints, old survey maps, anything on the structure of Blackwood Farm?" Rios didn't even look up from her keyboard, already pulling them from the county archives. "They'll be on the screen in 5 minutes." This was her language. Jake recognized it immediately. She was already a step ahead. He felt a flicker of professional respect. While they waited, he walked to one of the whiteboards, picked up a black marker, and began to sketch from memory. His hand moved with a fluid, confident speed, lines and angles appearing on the white surface. The farmhouse began to take shape, not as a building, but as a tactical problem. "The main structure is U-shaped," he explained, his back to her. "My point of entry was here, on the western trail. The cellar window where she's being held is on the rear wall, here." He drew a small X. "It provides minimal visibility from the main road. Good concealment." The captor chose his location well. The blueprints flashed onto the screen. Jake gave them only a cursory glance, his mental image already proving remarkably accurate. He added details, marking potential entry points, lines of sight from the surrounding woods, and the structural weaknesses he'd noted in the decaying architecture. "The biggest unknown is the captor's position within the structure," Jake continued, circling the main floor. "He's not in the cellar with her. Too cold, too exposed. He'll be on the first or second floor, somewhere with a view of the access road. He'll have a dead man switch, a way to get to her before you can breach." Meanwhile, Rios worked with a quiet, fierce intensity. Her focus was on the human element. "The fake call that lured Sarah out was for a non-existent car accident on Ridge Road," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "That road washes out a half-mile before the turnoff to the farm. Only a local would know that or someone who'd done extensive recon of the area." She began cross-referencing lists of known offenders and persons of interest with anyone who had a history in that specific, remote section of the county. Names scrolled across her screen. "Poachers, petty thieves, hermits, nothing fit. The knots," she said, thinking out loud. "They're the key. It's a signature." She typed in a new query, searching law enforcement databases for any local cases, solved or unsolved, that involved the use of Bolen knots. The system churned. Then, a single file popped up. A cold case from 5 years prior. "Got something," she breathed. The file detailed a home invasion and double homicide. An elderly couple, the Millers, found in their remote cabin. They had been bound. The medical examiner's report specifically noted the cause of death, but also the type of restraints used, expertly tied Bolen knots. The case had no forensics, no witnesses. It went cold. The lead investigator noted a person of interest who had been questioned but never charged due to a lack of evidence, a former park ranger who had recently been fired and had a history of disputes with the Millers over property lines. His name was Caleb Thorne. Rios's eyes scanned the file. Thorne was a skilled outdoorsman, a survivalist. He had served a short stint in the military before being discharged. After his dismissal from the Park Service, he had dropped off the grid, but his family owned property that abutted the old Blackwood farm. He knew the area like the back of his hand. "And here's the motive," Rios whispered, her voice tight with discovery. She pulled up another file. This time it was a formal complaint filed by Thorne against the Harrison County Sheriff's Department 3 years ago. His teenage daughter had been killed in a hit-and-run. The driver was never found. Thorne accused the department of incompetence, of giving up on his daughter's case because his family wasn't wealthy or important. He had developed a deep, simmering grudge against the uniform, against people like Sarah Jenkins. Sheriff Miller had been standing silently in the doorway for the last few minutes, watching. He had watched Jake break down his building like a master architect, and he had watched his best sergeant pull a ghost out of a 5-year-old file. He stepped into the room. "Caleb Thorne," Miller said, his voice low. "I remember that case. Man had a darkness in him. We could never prove a thing. He fits the profile, Sheriff," Rios said, turning to him. "The skill set, the local knowledge, the motive, it all lines up." At that moment, Ghost, who had been pacing relentlessly, stopped. He walked over to Jake and powerfully nudged his hand with his wet nose, letting out a single, sharp whine. The sound cut through the clinical atmosphere of the room. It was a raw, urgent plea. Jake placed a hand on the dog's head, his jaw tight. He turned away from his tactical map on the whiteboard and looked directly at the sheriff. "We have a suspect and a location," Jake said, his voice dangerously calm. "We're wasting time. It's time to make a plan." The sheriff looked from the ghost on Rios's screen to the battlefield on Jake's whiteboard to the unblinking intensity in the SEAL's eyes. The last vestiges of his skepticism crumbled, replaced by the grim weight of command. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right, son. Let's hear it." The cold was a living thing. It seeped up through the concrete floor, up the legs of the wooden chair, and into the bones of Deputy Sarah Jenkins. It was a deep, predatory cold that stole warmth and dulled the senses. But Sarah wouldn't let it win. She was a cop. More than that, she was a survivor. She focused on the pain, the sharp, radiating protest of her shoulder where she'd been struck, the raw, burning chafe of the ropes on her wrists, and used it as an anchor. Pain was better than numb. Pain meant she was still here. She had been in this damp, yellow-lit tomb for nearly 3 days, by her count. She tracked it by the man's visits. He came twice a day, bringing a bottle of water and a stale piece of bread. He never spoke to her directly, not in a way that expected an answer. He spoke at her, his words a disjointed, rambling monologue of pain and anger. His name was Caleb Thorne. He was the ghost of a man, tall and gaunt, with a wild, matted beard and eyes that burned with a feverish, paranoid light. He was wrapped in layers of old flannel and canvas, and he smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and a profound sadness. He wasn't a monster of pure evil. He was something far scarier. He was a man who had lost everything and been hollowed out, leaving a space for something else to take root. "They think they can forget," he mumbled now, pacing the small concrete space in front of her. His boots made soft, scraping sounds on the dusty floor. "They file it away. Cold case, like it's just a piece of paper. Not a life. Not my Sarah." He stopped and stared at her, but his eyes were looking through her, seeing something else entirely. "You wear the same uniform. You carry the same lie. The lie of protection, of justice." Sarah remained silent, her training kicking in. "Don't engage. Don't provoke. Be a small target." She kept her breathing even, her expression neutral, gathering intelligence with every word he spoke. "But he remembered," Caleb whispered, a strange, almost reverent tone creeping into his voice. He moved closer, and Sarah fought the instinct to recoil. "He found me. Said he knew my pain. Said the system protects its own, but there are other ways, a different kind of justice." This was new. For 3 days, his ramblings had been about his own loss. Now he was talking about someone else. "He said I just had to prove I was worthy," Caleb continued, his voice dropping low. "Prove I could follow instructions. This, he gestured vaguely at her. "This is the proof, a small task. Bring them a piece of their broken system and he'll give me the man who broke my family. An eye for an eye." A cold dread far deeper than the cellar's chill settled over Sarah. Caleb wasn't the architect of this. He was a tool, a broken, grieving man being used as a weapon by someone else, someone far more calculating and dangerous. She wasn't the target. She was a message. As Caleb turned away, lost in his own dark thoughts, Sarah let her mind drift to the one thing that had kept a flicker of hope alive in the suffocating dark. It had happened hours ago, maybe in the gray twilight of dawn. She had been drifting in and out of a shallow, restless sleep when a sound had cut through the muffled silence of the rain-soaked world outside, a faint scratching. At first, she thought it was a rat in the walls, but then came another sound, a low, mournful whine. It wasn't the wind. The wind was a howl, a roar. This was the sound of a living thing, an animal lost in the storm. For a fleeting moment, she had imagined a dog, its paws scratching at the plywood over the window, looking for shelter. The sound had stopped as quickly as it started, and she had almost convinced herself she had dreamed it. But the memory remained, a tiny, impossible seed of hope. What if it wasn't just a lost animal? What if it was a sign? Her thoughts were shattered by a sudden change in the room. Caleb stood frozen, his head snapped up. He was perfectly still, listening. From upstairs, a floorboard creaked under the weight of the rain-soaked roof. "Someone's out there," he hissed. His paranoia ignited instantly. He whirled, grabbing a heavy tire iron from a dusty shelf and lunged up the concrete stairs. The heavy door groaned open, then slammed shut, plunging the cellar back into near total darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the single bulb. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She listened, straining to hear anything over the thudding in her own ears. She heard the crunch of his boots on the gravel just above her. He was circling the building, checking the perimeter. Outside, the storm raged. Caleb Thorne trudged through the deep mud. The tire iron was clutched in his hand. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with icy droplets of rain. He trusted his instincts, the instincts of a ranger. And something was wrong. He scanned the tree line, a dark, shifting wall in the downpour. Nothing. He made a full circuit of the farmhouse and was about to go back inside when he saw it. A disturbance near the buried cellar window on the back wall. It wasn't just a pile of mud. The earth here looked churned up, dug away, and there, near the edge of the disturbed patch, was a single, perfect paw print deeper than the rest. Large, canine, a coyote maybe, but it was too close to the building and the indentation in the mud next to it. It looked almost like a place where someone had knelt. He stared at it, his mind racing. Was it just the wind, an animal, or was it them? Had they found him already? The promise that this place was a ghost, untouchable, a lie? Was it all a lie? He took a step forward, his eyes trying to pierce the curtain of falling rain. He could almost see shapes moving among the trees, shadows in the gray. He raised the tire iron, his knuckles white. But the rain was a powerful ally. Even as he watched, the edges of the paw print softened, the indentation filled. The evidence was being erased before his eyes. Doubt crept in. He was tired. He hadn't slept in days. His mind was playing tricks on him. It was just an animal. It had to be. He turned and stomped back to the door, his paranoia now laced with a frustrating uncertainty. He slammed the door shut and barred it with a heavy wooden plank. In the cellar, Sarah flinched at the sound. She had held her breath the entire time he was outside, a silent prayer on her lips, a prayer for a sound she might have only imagined. Caleb stumbled back down the stairs, his face a mask of agitated fury. He wasn't mumbling anymore. He was silent, and his silence was far more terrifying. He stopped in front of her, his breathing heavy, his burning eyes sweeping over her face. "If you're waiting for someone to come," he growled, his voice low and menacing, "you can stop. No one is coming for you." He turned and went back up the stairs, leaving her alone once more. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The fragile hope Sarah had clung to was now tangled with a new, sharper fear. He was spooked. An animal, when cornered, is at its most dangerous, and Caleb Thorne had just realized his wilderness was no longer empty. The briefing room at the Harrison County Sheriff's Department became the quiet eye of the storm. Outside, the wind howled a raw, mournful song, throwing sheets of rain against the windows. Inside was only the low, focused hum of activity. The air was thick with the smell of bitter coffee and the sharp, electric tension of a plan coming together. Sheriff Brody Miller stood by the topographical map, arms crossed, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim, heavy authority. He was the commander, and he was now listening intently to his new tactical advisor. Jake stood before the large whiteboard, now covered in his precise, angular handwriting. It was a web of entry points, contingencies, and risk assessments. He moved with a quiet, contained energy, the marker in his hand an extension of his thoughts. Sergeant Rios was at his side, a laptop open, Her fingers a blur as she cross-referenced personnel files and equipment inventories, translating Jake's strategic needs into tangible assets. Caleb Thorne is a ranger, a survivalist, Jake said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He thinks like a hunter. He will have chosen a high ground position, a nest. He'll be watching the most obvious approach, the access road. He tapped a red circle on his hand-drawn map of the farmhouse. Standard SRT procedure would be a dynamic entry from multiple points. That's a mistake here. The building is a death trap, and the noise will give him all the warning he needs to execute his hostage. Miller grunted in agreement. So, what's your plan, son? A ghost probe, Jake replied, turning to face them. We use the storm as cover. The wind and rain will mask our sound and thermal signatures. We don't go in hard, we go in silent. He looked down at Ghost, who was now lying at his feet, head up, ears pricked, listening to every word. He's our ghost. Rios looked up, her dark eyes sharp with understanding. You want to use the dog for recon? More than that, Jake corrected. Ghost can move through that terrain without making a sound. He can get close to the farmhouse and confirm Thorne's exact position by scent and sound. All without Thorne ever knowing he's there. He'll give us real-time target location before we make a single move. That's intel no drone can provide. The plan began to solidify. It was one built on stealth and precision, not force. They would approach on foot from the west, using the dense tree line Jake had mapped as cover. A small four-man team. Rios would lead it. Jake would go with them, acting purely as a consultant on the ground. Their goal was not to breach on arrival, but to set up a silent perimeter and wait for Ghost's signal. The assault would only commence at first light, using the disorienting shift from darkness to gray dawn as their moment of advantage. As Rios began making calls to assemble her team, Sheriff Miller called a brief halt. 5-minute break, he said, rubbing his tired eyes. Get more coffee. We move in 3 hours. Jake nodded and used the opportunity to step out into the small, rain-swept alley behind the station. The cold was a welcome shock, a clean, sharp slap that cleared his head. The relentless howl of the wind was a familiar sound, a companion on many long, dark nights in forgotten corners of the world. The back door of the Round Table Diner, which abutted the station, opened, and Maggie stepped out, a heavy coat wrapped tight around her, and 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She offered one to him without a word. The warmth seeped into his cold gloves. Figured you could use this, she said, her voice soft. You look like you're a million miles away. He took a long drink of the coffee. It was black and strong. Just about, he admitted, his gaze lost in the swirling rain. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, one forged over years of friendship. Maggie was one of the few people around whom he didn't have to pretend. It's different when it's home, isn't it? She asked quietly. When it's someone you know. He nodded slowly. On a mission, the target is a name on a file, a piece of intel. You build a wall. You have to. You focus on the mechanics, the objective. You execute. You extract. You leave. He looked down at the mug in his hands. This is messy. This is Sarah, the girl who used to help my mom with her groceries. This is your friend. He finally looked at her and for a second, she saw past the seal and saw the man. The enormous weight he carried was visible in the depths of his gray eyes. When you hold someone's life in your hands, Maggie, you can't be wrong. There's no margin for error. Maggie reached out and gently touched his arm. Her touch was warm and steady. You won't be wrong, Jake. You've got Ghost, and you've got good people in there listening to you. She gave him a small, sad smile. Just come back, all of you. He finished the coffee and handed the empty mug back to her. Thanks, Maggie. Go get our friend, she said, before slipping back into the warmth of her diner. Jake stood alone in the cold for another moment, the simple warmth of her words settling something inside him. He was a weapon, forged and honed by the United States military. But Maggie had just reminded him what he was fighting for. He went back into the briefing room. The mood had shifted. The theory was over. Rios had assembled her team. Standing with her was Deputy Marcus Evans, head of the Harrison County Sheriff's response team. He was a big man, built like a linebacker, with a calm, steady presence and a neatly trimmed beard. He regarded Jake with a look of professional curiosity, not hostility. Sergeant Rios briefed me, Evans said, his voice a low, even rumble. It's a sound plan. My team is ready to move on your signal. We'll be your outer cordon, Rios clarified, pointing to the map. Evans and his guys will be the primary breach element. You and I, with Ghost, are the tip of the spear. We confirm the target. We call the strike. Jake nodded, his focus absolute once more. Let's gear up. The last hour was a quiet ritual of preparation, the metallic click of magazines being loaded, the snap of gear being attached to tactical vests, the low murmur of radio checks. Ghost sat by the door, a statue of patient readiness, his amber eyes locked on Jake. He knew the waiting was almost over. The hunt was about to begin. They were no longer just a man and his dog. They were a weapons system, aimed and ready, about to step out into the heart of the storm. The pre-dawn movement was a slow, methodical crawl. The world was a vortex of green and gray, a featureless landscape where the only constants were the biting wind and the bone-deep dampness. Led by Jake and Ghost, the small team moved like wraiths through the downpour. They were dark shapes against the darker woods. Sergeant Rios, Jake, and her two most trusted deputies, their forms blurred by the storm. Every step was deliberate, carefully placed to avoid snapping a hidden, rain-slicked branch or dislodging a cascade of wet leaves. Jake was in his element. This was the hostile environment he was trained for, where senses other than sight became paramount. He moved with a preternatural awareness, his body attuned to the shifting weight of the mud beneath his boots, the howl of the wind masking their advance. But his primary focus was on the animal at his side. Ghost was their tip of the spear. The German Shepherd moved low to the ground, a black and tan phantom against the forest floor, his nose twitching, constantly reading the story the wind was telling. Their communication was a silent dance of subtle hand signals from Jake and infinitesimal shifts in Ghost's posture. Sergeant Rios moved behind them, her weapon held at a low ready, her eyes constantly scanning. She was an impressive field commander, calm and decisive, trusting the unique asset she'd been given but never ceding control of her team. She had put her faith in the SEAL and his dog, and now she was betting her deputy's life on that faith. After nearly an hour of tense, arduous progress, they reached their designated rally point, a dense thicket of trees on a ridge overlooking Blackwood Farm. Below them, the building was a dark, sleeping beast, almost completely swallowed by the gloom. Deputy Evans and his breach team were in a similar position on the opposite flank, waiting, invisible. The moment had come. Jake knelt in the mud, bringing his face level with Ghost's. The dog's amber eyes were locked on his, intelligent and ready. There was no fear, only a deep, vibrating focus. Jake didn't speak. He gave a single, soft tap to the dog's head and then pointed toward the farmhouse. The command was silent, simple, and absolute. Find him. Ghost moved. He didn't run. He flowed away from them, melting into the driving rain, a shadow detaching from other shadows. He used every dip in the terrain, every rain-lashed bush for cover. From the ridge, it was a nearly imperceptible movement. And then he was gone. Now they waited. The tension on the ridge was absolute. Every member of the team remained frozen in place, their breath held tight in their chests. Their lives, and Sarah's, now rested on the senses of an animal. Ghost reached the rear of the farmhouse, where he and Jake had first discovered the window. The scent was stronger here. The scent of the captive, of fear and sweat and quiet endurance. And the other scent, that of the predator, Caleb Thorne. It was acrid, laced with old anger and paranoia. Ghost ignored the cellar window. The man wasn't there. The scent was old. He followed the fresher trail, which led him along the wall to a set of rotting wooden steps leading to a side door. He didn't approach the door. He moved past it, his paws making no sound, and stopped beneath a large, first-floor window, its glass broken and covered with a sheet of clear plastic that rattled in the wind. The scent was strongest here. Ghost raised his head, his sensitive ears twitching, filtering out the roar of the storm. He heard it, the faint, rhythmic creak of a floorboard, the weak rustle of clothing, the slow, steady sound of a man breathing. This was the nest. He turned his head back toward the ridge. He couldn't bark. He couldn't make a sound that would carry. Instead, he emitted a low, almost sub-vocal whine, a specific frequency he and Jake had practiced 1,000 times. It was a sound that would be swallowed by the wind to anyone else, but to Jake, it was as clear as a bell. It meant target acquired. Position confirmed. Awaiting orders. On the ridge. Jake heard it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod to Rios. Phase 1 was complete. But then something changed. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb Thorne was jolted awake. A strong gust of wind had sent a heavy, waterlogged branch crashing against the side of the house with a loud thud. To his paranoid mind, it was the sound of an assault. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. He crept to the window, peering through a tear in the plastic. He saw nothing but the endless, frantic dance of the rain. But the seed of panic had been sown. The waiting was over. The man who had promised him justice hadn't called. The world was silent. He was alone with his ghosts. He decided in a flash of judgment born of fear and instability that it was time to erase the trail. It was time to silence the woman in the cellar. He grabbed his heavy tire iron and moved toward the interior door that led to the stairs. Ghost heard the change immediately. The rhythmic breathing was gone, replaced by a frantic shuffling. The floorboards above him groaned as the man moved with a new, violent purpose. He was moving toward the back of the house, toward the cellar. Ghost's signal changed. The low hum was replaced by two sharp, urgent whines, followed by a low growl. It was their emergency signal. Target is mobile. Hostage is in imminent danger. Execute now. Jake didn't hesitate. He looked at Rios, his eyes like chips of ice. Go, he said, his voice a blade in the wind. Rios spoke into her radio, her voice crisp and clear. Alpha team, execute. Execute. The world exploded into motion. Rios and her team scrambled down the slope, their stealth abandoned for speed. On the other side, Evans's team did the same. They converged on the main entrance. There was a small, muffled pop as a breaching charge blew the lock. The door flew open. They poured inside. A fast, dark tide of tactical gear and focused intent. In the cellar, Sarah heard the heavy footsteps pounding on the concrete stairs. She saw Caleb Thorne appear, his face a mask of wild-eyed terror, the iron bar raised high. This was it, the end. She closed her eyes. The cellar door, which Thorne had left open in his haste, was kicked wide. It slammed against the concrete wall with a deafening crack. Rios was the first one through, the light on her weapon blinding Caleb. Sheriff's Department. Drop it now. She yelled. Thorne was momentarily stunned, but his rage was stronger than his fear. He let out a roar and lunged toward Sarah, the tire iron swinging down, but he never reached her. From the doorway, a black and tan blur shot past Rios. Ghost had been released. He moved with the speed and precision of a guided missile. He didn't aim for the throat. He aimed for the weapon. His jaws clamped down on Thorne's forearm with immense, controlled pressure. There was a sickening crack of bone and a scream of agony from Thorne. The tire iron clattered to the floor. Before Thorne could react, Evans and his team were on him, driving him to the ground, cuffing his hands behind his back. It was all over in less than 5 seconds, a symphony of violent precision. Jake was the last one into the cellar. He ignored the struggling, screaming form of Caleb Thorne. His only focus was the woman in the chair. He moved to her side, pulling a combat knife from his vest. Deputy Jenkins, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. I'm cutting you loose. Sarah opened her eyes. She saw the face of a stranger in tactical gear, with sharp gray eyes. Then she looked past him and saw the magnificent dog standing guard over her, his body poised, his amber eyes watching her with a quiet, protective intelligence. The sound she had heard, the scratching, the whining. It hadn't been a dream. Help had come. The fluorescent lights of Harrison County General Hospital were harsh and sterile white, a world away from the single yellow bulb that had been Amelia Vance's sun for 3 days. The air smelled of antiseptic and clean linens. She was propped up against a stack of pillows, an 4-line taped neatly to the back of her hand, her bruised face now clean, her dark hair washed and brushed. She could feel the dull, throbbing ache in her shoulder and the raw sensitivity of her wrists. But beneath the pain, there was a deep and overwhelming sense of peace. She was safe. The door to her room opened quietly. Jake Callahan stepped inside. He was no longer the tactical shadow she had seen in the cellar. He was dressed in simple jeans and a dark Henley shirt, his short hair still damp from a shower. He looked younger, less like a weapon and more like the man she vaguely remembered seeing around town. He offered a small, hesitant smile. Deputy Jenkins, he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. Sarah. It's good to see you back with us. Please, she said, her voice a little hoarse, but steady. Call me Sarah, and thank you, Jake. She searched for the words, but they felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for your life? Before she could finish, a second figure appeared in the doorway, moving with a silent, confident grace. Ghost padded into the room, his claws making no sound on the polished floor. He stopped at the foot of her bed, head tilted, his intelligent amber eyes locked on hers. Sarah's breath hitched. The carefully constructed wall of professional calm she had maintained since her rescue crumbled to dust. A single tear tracked its way down her cheek, then another. It wasn't the man who had cut her bonds who had broken her composure. It was the dog, the ghost in the storm, the impossible hope she had clung to in the darkness. It was you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I heard you. I thought I was dreaming. Ghost whined softly and moved closer. Sarah slowly, carefully, reached her uninjured hand out over the side of the bed. The German shepherd stepped forward and gently pressed his head into her palm, his thick fur soft against her skin. She closed her eyes, the simple, solid reality of his presence a comfort more powerful than any drug. He was real. Her hope had been real. Jake watched the scene in silence, a quiet understanding passing between him and the woman in the bed. He knew that Ghost had done something in that moment that he, with all his training, never could. He had rescued her twice. Meanwhile, in a small, windowless gray room at the sheriff's department, Caleb Thorne sat slumped at a metal table, his arm in a cast, his face a pale mask of defeat. The wild, feverish light had gone out of his eyes, leaving a bleak, empty landscape. Sheriff Miller and Sergeant Rios sat opposite him. There was no need for a good cop, bad cop routine. They just needed the truth. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Caleb mumbled, staring at his cuffed hands. He said no one would get hurt. He said it was just a test. A test for what, Caleb? Rios asked, her voice calm. A surgeon searching for a bullet. Who is he? I don't know his name, Thorne said, shaking his head. He found me online, in one of those forums for unsolved cases. He knew all about my Sarah. He knew how you, he spat, looking at Miller. Let her case go cold. He said he was part of a group that gets justice for people like me. The ones the system forgets. Miller leaned forward, his voice a low gravel. And you believed him? You believed a shadow on the internet who promised you vengeance if you just kidnapped one of my deputies? He had proof, Caleb insisted, his voice rising with a cracked, desperate energy. He sent me things, internal police reports about my daughter's case that were never released. He knew things only a cop would know. He said his group had people on the inside. He said if I did this for them, showed them I had the skills and the commitment, they would give me the man who killed my daughter. His face crumpled. It was all for Sarah. And what was the plan after the test? Rios pressed, relentless. What were you going to do with Sarah? Thorne flinched. He was supposed to call after 3 days. He was going to send a vehicle, a cleaner, to take her away. He said she'd be used as leverage to expose corruption in the department. He said she wouldn't be harmed. A bitter, broken laugh escaped his lips. It was all a lie, wasn't it? He never called. He was never going to call. He just left me there to rot. He used your pain, Caleb, Miller said, his voice softening just a fraction, a father speaking to a lost son. He took your grief and aimed it like a rifle, and you let him. The man who killed your daughter is still out there, and now you'll never be the one to find him. That was the final blow that broke him. The realization that he wasn't an avenger, but a fool, a pawn. He sagged forward, his shoulders shaking with silent, violent sobs. He had sacrificed his freedom, not for justice, but for the empty promises of a ghost. Later that evening, the core of the team gathered back in the briefing room. The storm had finally broken, and through the windows, a few stars could be seen in the cold, clear sky. Sarah was there, out of the hospital against doctor's orders, her arm now in a sling, but her eyes clear and determined. Jake stood beside her, Ghost seated loyally at their feet. Rios and Miller stood before the large county map on the wall. The map was different now. The small red circle around Blackwood Farm was still there, but now there were other markings. A blue pin near the site of the hidden that killed Thorne's daughter. A yellow pin marking another cold case Rios had found. A hiker who had vanished without a trace 2 years ago. A case that was also full of strange inconsistencies. The pieces didn't form a clear picture yet, but they were no longer random. They were a pattern. Thorne's handler used a burner phone routed through a dozen overseas servers, Rios reported, her voice grim. He's a ghost, but he was right about one thing. The information he sent Thorne on his daughter's case. It came from a sealed file. There's a leak. Someone on the inside, maybe not here, but somewhere in the state law enforcement network is feeding information to this group. So, we have a kidnapping, a potential murder, and a conspiracy that reaches into our own ranks, Miller summarized, his voice heavy. We closed one case today only to open a door to something much, much bigger. No one spoke for a long moment. The weight of the discovery settled over them. They had pulled on a single loose thread, and now the entire tapestry of their quiet, rural county was in danger of unraveling. Jake looked at Sarah, her gaze fixed on the map, her expression one of fierce determination. He looked at Rios, already mentally cataloging new leads. He looked at Miller, a man watching the borders of his small kingdom threatened by an unknown enemy. His 2 weeks of leave were almost up. He had a mission, a life, a world far from this rain-soaked town. But as he looked at the faces in the room, he knew he couldn't just walk away. The mission wasn't over. It had just begun. They used Thorne because he was broken and desperate, Sarah said, her voice quiet but strong, her eyes meeting Jake's. They're preying on the forgotten. We can't let them. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of intent, a newly sworn oath. Jake gave a slow, deliberate nod. The four of them stood before the map, an unlikely alliance forged in the heart of a storm. The hardened SEAL, the resilient deputy, the whip-smart sergeant, and the old-school sheriff. And at their feet, Ghost rose, moving to position himself between Jake and Sarah, a silent, furry sentinel taking his place on a new and dangerous watch. They were no longer just rescuing one of their own. They were now the guardians of Harrison County, ready to face the larger darkness that was waiting in the shadows.